and I liked how you started talking about when we look at integration of the body and the myofascial lines, and how basically we have, and as Myers put it, we have a warp and weft with forces that are introduced. What do you look at, and we have a lot of questions that arise on, okay, looking at a reductionistic form, and then also this longitudinal anatomy. How does that go into movement? And we look at sphere of function. When we question technique, when we question form, what are we looking for now that we have this integrated view on the body?
Well, let's kind of back up. It's a great question. Let's back up. To answer that question, let me back up a little bit to say, okay, what are some things that are important in motion, right? Because if we're looking at the whole in terms of motion, and we're talking about technique of motion, well, what characterizes motion? When I first came out of university, I thought the only viable structure that creates motion is muscle, right? So every conversation subsequent to that was, well, what are the muscles doing? Are they stabilizing? And if not, should there be a stabilizing factor with the muscle? What muscles are predominant in the motion, and how do I effectively enhance that muscle action? But really the reality is, as we're all learning now, is that any viscoelastic tissue is inherently important in motion. So in other words, anything that can extend to load and then contract to unload will have the characteristic to help motion. So we think, well, muscle's one of them, for sure. It's viscoelastic, it has the ability to extend and contract, excellent. How about skin? You know, skin is our heaviest organ. But then if you listen to a guy, you know, maybe like Serge Grakovetsky, he might say, Jake, if our heaviest organ is the skin, consider this for a second, if the heaviest organ is the skin, and it had no contribution to motion at all, would it be a penalty to the bony structures of the skeletal system of the body? Would it be a penalty to the muscular system? And might it be a penalty to the, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, if it had to carry the heaviest organ around for a lifetime, and that organ had nothing to do with motion? And you'd say, yeah, that is a penalty. So would Mother Nature prepare us and design us so that we carried this heavy bag of skin around and it had no contribution of motion? The answer would be no. So when we stretch skin, it's viscoelastic. So the first thing is skin helps us move. Okay? Muscles help us move. We knew that. How about fascia? Fascia helps us move because it too is viscoelastic. It has the ability to contract. It has the ability to extend. It has the ability body-wide to stabilize. So then we ask ourselves, okay, if there's now three elements to this conversation of motion, skin, muscle, fascia, and they all contribute to motion, and maybe fascia, it has a better ability to stabilize the body, and a better ability to actually produce body-wide motion, then all of a sudden we think that's a different concept. So then how do we affect the muscle system? We kind of know that already. How do we affect the skin and fascial systems in the context of training? Well, most of us don't know that, right? So now it comes down to, if all those three things are hugely important in the motion of the body, well, how does the fascia respond to load? Well, it's not through the neurological system. So if I want to get a response in through the fascia for a training effect, it's not through the nervous system as such. That's not going to trigger the myofibroblasts, which are the kind of the contractile elements of the fascia. It's through force. So lines of load through the body will trigger the myofibroblasts of the fascia, and then they will react to get stronger and more of an ability to stabilize and move the body. Right? So that's one. So how do we introduce that? Well, we introduce lines of force. So tools like we have in our gym that enter into the body with lines of force, gravity-ground reaction forces. And the biggest thing is vector variability. And vector variability is angulations, as you guys are learning, angulations of force into the body. So if the argument is, I want a certain technique to evoke a certain lift, let's say I'm a power lifter, right? Or let's say I'm an Olympic weightlifter. Yes, there's a certain technique that may bring about a certain result, and I need to learn that technique. But the irony of it all is, that's like throwing a slider. There's a certain technique to the slider, but underpinning that technique, I better have a basic function. In other words, by the time I get to the specificity of my training, which we call a certain squat, a certain throw, a certain whatever, that's a technique, we better have a broad basic function, because if not, the body itself is not going to tolerate that specificity. So let's kind of define a certain technique. If it's a squat, if it's a throw, if it's a kick, if it's a whatever, that is a certain technique. But what we have to do is make sure that the body has a broad base of function. To give it a broad base of function, we have to open up different angulations for vector variability. Vector is a force into the body with magnitude and direction, right? So I need to have a lot of different directions of force in through the body, and that's the variability component. Because once I have vector variability, that allows the body to have what we call super stiffness. It can create body-wide stiffness so that when I get to the technique of a squat and a throw, my body can stabilize itself from all different directions body-wide. So what we would say is, if you're training a squat pattern, the first question is it a certain technique? If it's not, vary it. You have to vary it. There is no such thing as doing a squat with a certain technique unless you're in a specific activity or sport that requires it. If not, what we have to do is look at different footprint patterns, look at different angulations of the pelvis to give it vector variability so the fascial system and the muscular system can actually get stronger body-wide as a net. And that's really key. That's a departure, because for us it was, if I'm training and I'm doing a workout, I've got to do it with this technique to be safer. And the irony is it's not as safe. We're setting ourselves up for failure later on because we're only strengthening our body in a certain dimension in the absence of other planes and other variabilities for the vector. So that's what I would say in terms of asking the question, what's the goal? If it's a specific power lift, great, but to get there, you got to change up your technique, so to speak, to get your body strong.
Yeah, I think that was very well said, because when we start training clients and we look at program design, we start to look at what type of foundation are we building for their movement pattern. And so really, I mean, that was very well said. I think that's everything. So